Hey everybody, welcome into the latest edition of the Postcast, production of the cast for Star-Tribune and Pokes Authority. I am Davis Potter, Wyoming beat writer for the Star-Tribune, and I'm joined, as always, by our managing editor, former Wyoming beatnik, Brandon Foster. Brandon, happy opening day to you.
To you as well. I'm not wearing it, but I'm ready with my Colorado Rockies Nolan Arenado jersey that I bought on clearance after he got traded to the Cardinals because I'm a spiteful person, I guess. No, because two birds with one stone. I always kind of wanted a Rockies piece of attire with them being the nearest MLB team here, and it was cheap because he's now on my favorite team. So go Birds.
So you're wearing that jersey right now as we speak?
If I was smart, I would, but it's in my closet. I'll put it on after this.
Okay.
I mean, it's a podcast. I should have just said yes.
Yeah, that's true.
Who's going to fact check me?
Hey, man. Well, at least you root for a team that actually has a chance to win the NL Central this season, as opposed to one that does not. So,
I think every team has a chance to win the NL Central this year.
Well, I can unequivocally say that the Pittsburgh Pirates absolutely do not. But
it's a division for the taking, but perhaps, not by Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it's really exciting, that the quest for 60 wins, and looking forward to the trade deadline where they dump their top pitcher or position player because they don't want to spend a few extra bucks. That's all. That annual tradition is always fun to look forward to. So,
I didn't like those couple of years there where you guys were actually good. That was not convenient for me.
Yeah, well, you didn't have to worry about it lasting because, like I said, they had Garrett Cole and those guys that, I mean, to be fair, they probably couldn't afford to pay him, but I don't think they were even going to consider the possibility of even paying him that kind of money. So and then just shipping everybody off before spring training or anybody that's really good. But hey, they do have an NL Rookie of the Year candidate in Brian Hayes, so I guess that's the one good thing to look forward to, I guess, until he gets traded eventually.
There you go. You may think we're off topic with this discussion, but Nolan Arenado did play for the Casper Ghosts, so there you go, bringing it back to Wyoming. Yeah.
Hey, man, always trying to find a way to intertwine some local connections. But Brandon, let's go ahead and dive into some Wyoming athletics, and we talked about Wyoming's offense last week, so We'll take a look at Wyoming's defense heading into spring football practice, which is scheduled to start on Tuesday. And then we'll talk a little bit more NCAA tournament now that both the men's and women's tournaments are down to the Final Four, and some very wild comments that one high-profile women's basketball coach made after her team was bounced in the bubble there down in Texas. But before we dive into that, Brandon, just for anybody who may have missed it, Wyoming has its first basketball player in the transfer portal in Quan Marble, and he has already announced that he will reunite with former Wyoming coach Alan Edwards at Loyola Marymount. That's where Alan is an assistant coach now after being fired from his job at Wyoming, I guess about a year ago now, last March. But I don't know, Brandon, not really all that surprising. He made 13 starts this year, but he ended the season coming off the bench and didn't get a ton of minutes in the Mountain West tournament, particularly their last game of the season at San Diego State. And with a team like Jeff Landers, who's going to be guard / wing oriented, that's a position that's getting crowded very quickly. And you've already got guys like Brandon Foster, Kenny Foster, and Hunter Maldonado, and then Xavier Dussel emerged late last season and started into the season as a starter and one of their better shooters. And then you're adding a transfer from Utah and Brendan Wenzel next year, who's probably going to be a heavy contributor for them. So, I guess just the way it was trending for him towards the end of the season, just not really all that surprising.
Yeah, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's immediate eligibility for anyone who transfers right now because of kind of the
assuming the one-time transfer passes, which I'm almost certain it will.
Okay, yeah.
I mean that's why the transfer portal is so busy right now, is in anticipation of the one-time transfer waiver being implemented at some point this year.
Sure, yeah, and I think I saw in the SEC at least the average someone tweeted out yesterday was like 4 players leaving per program. Like, I'm not sure what it is in the Mountain West, but I think it's kind of a reality of college basketball in general right now that it's hard to avoid turnover even if things go well. Throw in the added complication of this waiver, and it's kind of to be expected, honestly, with as good of a year as they had, that you're not going to bring every single piece back. So it sounds like a lot of mouths to feed right now at that position. So I guess, like you said, shouldn't be too shocked.
No, and it may be a situation too where in his mind he thinks, I go from, a fringe starter, at Wyoming, and probably, in his mind, probably thinking coming off the bench going forward, to now you go to a more low profile school in the West Coast Conference who, by the way, outside of Gonzaga, I really couldn't name one school in the West Coast Conference until I actually looked up where Loyola Marymount was, what conference they were in when I was, writing this story, and found out they were in the same conference as Gonzaga, but had no idea. But it could be a situation where you go from that kind of role to a lower tier program where maybe you think you can start and go in there and be a huge contributor for them, and obviously there's a comfortability there, right, with the coach that initially recruited him to Wyoming and Allen. So best of luck to him, and hope it works out for him.
Yeah, and you can always lie and say you're at the Sister Jean school without trying too hard. Yeah, I play for Loyola.
Yeah, that's a good point. As you mentioned, though, if you don't have at least one player leaving your program right now, you're one of the lucky ones, because, like I said, with that one-time transfer waiver most likely being passed at some point by the NCAA later this year. The transfer portal is just crazy right now. But we'll see if anybody else decides to transfer out. But as of now, there's just one for Wyoming. But Brandon, let's go ahead and transition into football and talk a little bit about this Wyoming defense heading into the spring, which, like a lot of other positions and like the offensive side of the ball, the theme is, and this way with a lot of teams, given the extended eligibility that the NCAA has granted amid the pandemic, but a lot of experience, a lot of guys coming back. And Wyoming actually is set to return all 11 starters on the defensive side of the ball. And they obviously got a boost in that department with the return of Garrett Krall, Braden Smith, Esaias Gandy, some of those seniors who have elected to take advantage of that extra year and return for another season. But it's a little bit more interesting on the defensive side of the ball as opposed to the offense, because now you're getting the players who opted out of last season coming back. 5 of the 6 players that opted out were on the defensive side of the ball. You get those guys back for the spring, which Craig Bohl has said that all the players that opted out have since returned to the team, so they're expected to go through spring drills. Normally you would sit there and say, or look at the depth chart and look at the guys who ended the season as starters at some of these positions and say, well, they got there by necessity, right? Because of all the opt-outs and some of the injuries and just the attrition in general forced some guys, particularly on the defensive line, to step into more prominent roles than they were going to be playing if none of that had happened. But I am curious maybe to see more on the defensive side of the ball, if there might be more real competition at those spots, given the way some of those guys performed last year. We talk about Braden Smith. He's an older, he's a senior who actually got beat out back in 2019 by Rowan Weber, who's a redshirt freshman that year and started all but one game at safety. But Braden's an older guy, seasoned vet, who just went through his first full season, albeit it was obviously cut short with the pandemic, so they basically played half the season. But, is that a position where there's going to be more competition? Now that you're bringing back a player in Rome, and really all the players that have opted out, which includes Solomon Byrd at defensive end, Mario Moore at defensive tackle. What are those guys going to look like coming back? Are they going to have to shake off some rust? Are they going to have to, get back in playing shape? Things like that. So, you think about not only safety, but I just mentioned Mario Mora with Jordan Bertinoli, who was really the real breakout star for them last year, who's the walk-on from Casper, the Natrona County product, who was really an afterthought on the depth chart going into last season. Then all of a sudden you get the opt-outs and some of the injuries that piled up on their defensive line. And, he finds himself as a starter by the end of the season, and I think finished as their third or fourth leading tackler. Actually had, I'm going to pull up these stats real quick. Yeah, finished as their fourth leading tackler with 31 tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks from his defensive tackle spot. So I guess I'm saying all that to say that you would expect maybe some of these guys to go right back into their starting roles, but I don't necessarily think it's a given, given how some of these other guys performed in their absence, and should make for an interesting competition maybe not only this spring, but heading into the summer and into the fall.
Yeah, I think, a lot of times the things you have to work through to build good depth aren't maybe fun in the moment, but they can leave you better off in the long run, whether it's, injuries or just lack of, bodies with the opt-outs like you mentioned. But, it's kind of, it feels like the default now for this program that they're going to have a good defense, right? Which is kind of, that's a testament to the program Bowles built, I think, because that very much was not the case the first three I'm trying to think, years of his tenure. So even with all the turnover at defensive coordinator, they've had those expectations built in, and depth is a huge part of maintaining that consistency. I think you can obviously still only put 11 guys on the field at the same time, so you need standout players in addition to depth. But it'll be interesting to see who gets their jobs back, and who maybe made a case last year to stay there.
Yeah, and that's sort of the blessing in disguise, right? I mean, sort of as you just mentioned, the fact that you did have so much attrition, particularly on the defensive line. That you ended up getting so many guys that you didn't necessarily expect to play significant roles, a bunch of snaps. Going forward, that's only going to help you. And particularly on the interior of the defensive line again, Ravante Holt. Craig Bowl said earlier in the offseason that he's coming off his second major knee injury, and he probably won't be. He's not expected to be full speed until sometime this summer. So right now he's sort of limited, and I don't even know if he's going to be available for spring at all. But he's their starting defensive tackle when he's healthy, or has been that the last couple of years. So again, I think that's another chance for Jordan Bertinoli or Cole Godbow, some of these guys, to get some more reps, and even at linebacker, that was the position that was the big question mark for Wyoming last year after losing Logan Wilson and Cash Malawia. But that's gone from being one of the biggest question marks on this defense to a strength now. I mean, given what Chad Muma did last year, 72 tackles in 6 games. He finished third in the FBS in tackles per game, led him in tackles for loss. And, if he has another big year like that, he's going to quickly get on some NFL teams' radars in terms of being a possible draft pick there at middle linebacker. And then you had Charles Hicks, filling it outside linebacker, and really had a solid season in his first year as a full-time starter. Finished 6th on the team or 7th on the team in tackles. But, you got another young linebacker in Easton Gibbs, who was Charles's primary backup last season, actually started a game late in the year when Charles got hurt. And he actually finished third on the team with 42 tackles. So, the linebackers actually accounted for more than 30% of the tackles last year for this Wyoming defense. And now you've got 3 guys there that have sort of been in those wars and built up that experience over time. So this is I guess it's a good problem to have if you're Craig Bowl and Jay Sawvell, the defensive coordinator, is you had a lot of questions last spring going into this, and this spring, you don't have nearly as many of them, and really you have to figure out, maybe outside of your primary guys like a Garrett Crawl, like a Chad Muma, some of those guys, who's going to fit where and who's going to get the majority of the snaps.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, obviously the stats are all a little wonky last year with teams having played a wide variety of games, but even, just looking at the averages, this was a defense that was, looks like 24th nationally in points per game, which is obviously a good place to be. It's actually 4th in the Mountain West, though. There's, a lot of good defenses around this conference, but, on top of that, this is defense that obviously had to kind of carry the load for this team last year, and there were offensive struggles, which tends to lead to the defense maybe being on the field a little bit more. I mean, I think that slightly evens out when you have a run heavy team like Wyoming that can chew some clock up, but if you look at yards per play, it's even better. It's 14th in the nation, and I think it seems like there's no reason to think this won't be a strength for this team again. It's just, we've talked so much about the offense. I think it comes down a little bit to those question marks on offense. Can they get answered? And otherwise, you're kind of nitpicking on the defensive end between, okay, is this a really good defense who can give us a chance to win every game because we're only giving up 2 touchdowns, or can they steal us a game here and there? Can they throw a shutout, or can they force 5 turnovers and create their own scoring, that kind of stuff. So obviously it's either way, it feels like you're maybe asking more out of one side than the other. But I mean, that's sort of the reality of where we are at coming into this season. And I mean, it's good at least to have one side that you feel like you can rely on. So I mean, I think playing more questions on the offensive end right now for me at least, looking at this team.
No, I'm with you. I mean, Wyoming's defense should be one of the best in the Mountain West again next year. I mean, look, even with this patchwork defensive line that they had last season, they still finished in the top 30 nationally in rushing yards allowed and points allowed. And you've got basically your entire 2 deep coming back. So, if they're not, at or near the top in a lot of defensive categories next year, something went terribly, terribly wrong. Because I mean, like we said, there's so much experience and really probably the most depth that they've had in a while on that side of the ball. I think the one area that I think they're going to have to improve in is the pass rush. Now look, in terms of the stats, they finished with 17 sacks in 6 games last year. So when you look at it on paper, it wasn't terrible. The only problem was, particularly without Solomon Byrd, who was their sack leader as a freshman All-American back in 2019 before he opted out last year, they had to come up with a bunch of different ways to generate that pressure. And their leading sacker last season was Chad Muma at linebacker, and he had 3. So unless you're playing a 3-4 and it's an edge rusher or an outside linebacker, a linebacker leading you in sacks isn't great.
Yeah.
So I mean, they're going to have to generate some more pressure with their front 4. And I think, obviously, getting Solomon Byrd back in the fold, I think that's going to be a huge upgrade. But I still think they need some more guys to develop in that aspect, because he led him in sacks back in 2019, but he only had like 6 or 6.5 in 13 games. So they still need some other guys in that front 4, particularly some of these younger defensive ends, maybe to really step up and give them that sort of threat off the edge.
Yeah, and I mean, just using the Super Bowl as an obvious example, I mean, you can see in games like that where if you can generate pressure just with your front 4 without having to get too creative with blitzes, everything kind of follows suit for the whole defense from there. Yeah,
no, totally. So, I think it would be interesting maybe to see some of the competition at some of these positions where Wyoming's getting some of these players back who opted out last year, and if some of these guys are just going to automatically go back to the top of the depth chart, or if they're going to have to earn those positions back. So that'll be interesting to watch, and I I don't know if that competition will start in earnest this spring or if it may not start until the fall. But I think it's at least going to give Jay Sawvell a chance to reevaluate some things and see where these players coming back off of the opt-outs are physically and mentally, just in terms of the playbook. So, Brandon, I think we can go ahead and take a break there. And then when we come back on the other side, we'll talk some more NCAA tournament.
Cool.
Welcome back into the Postcast, and Brandon, we're pretty close to crowning a national champion in both men's and women's side in college basketball. How's that Final Four looking, man?
Well, I my Final Four is not great, but I had a few correct predictions on this podcast. I'm going to say I said, quote, UCLA is going to go to the Final Four. Don't listen to it, because then I immediately said that I was kidding. But I did say it, so that's not nothing. In reference to the fact that there's always, as you were saying, a team that shouldn't even be in the tournament at that 11 seed play-in, and then they go on a roll, and that's sure enough what happened. And I also said Missouri would win. And while they lost their first round game, Mizzou won in the second round. Because Kansas lost. So I got a couple predictions right.
Yeah, there you go. Well,
but yeah, no, my bracket's terrible.
Well, I also said that Houston was going to make the Final Four until I didn't have them making the Final Four, because I said I was going to change my pick to Illinois, which I did.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, well, I guess we should say for anybody who isn't aware, the Final Four is set. On the men's side and the women's side. Men's Final Four will start on Saturday, and it is consists of Houston, UCLA, Gonzaga, and Baylor. And then on the women's side, the Final Four teams are Stanford, UConn, South Carolina, and Arizona. And the women's Final Four actually start Friday night. But yeah, I think particularly the men's tournament, I think this is sort of representative of the kind of college basketball season it was, because outside of Gonzaga and Baylor, before Baylor had its COVID pause, and it took them a little while to sort of get their mojo back, I guess, particularly on the defensive end, and nobody else was dominant. And, I mean, it seemed like everybody, it was wide open. Like, yeah, Michigan looked dominant at times. Illinois looked dominant at times. But, I mean, from wire to wire, nobody outside of Gonzaga and Baylor in college basketball really had long stretches where they just completely overwhelmed their opponents. And I think this tournament sort of is showing that, right? I mean, you mentioned that UCLA going from the playing game as 11 seed to the Final Four, and you had a 12 seed in Oregon State in the Elite Eight. You had a Loyola team who was probably underseeded. I mean, that's a good team, but they get to the Sweet 16 as an 8 seed. I mean, you had a lot of double-digit upsets. I think more than usual, and I think that's just sort of indicative of the way this season was, where it was pretty wide open outside of two teams. I mean, you could make the argument maybe that Gonzaga was really the only dominant team, since they're vying to be the first undefeated national champion since Bob Knight's Indiana Hoosiers back in 1976. But before Baylor had to go on that long COVID pause, I mean, they were rolling too. Mm-hmm. I mentioned this on our episode where we were previewing the NCAA tournament back when the field was originally announced a few weeks ago. But Baylor was as good as Gonzaga, or at least they looked as good as Gonzaga did. And, they were supposed to meet in a non-conference game back in December before they had to cancel it because of the pandemic. And I said then on that podcast a few weeks ago that I thought we would ultimately get the Baylor-Gonzaga matchup that we were all supposed to get a few months ago. And I still think that's going to happen. And Brandon, as you're aware, I actually picked that in our office pool bracket. But so I'm I'm rooting for that for more reasons than one. But
go Cougs.
Yeah, thanks. But, outside of Baylor and Gonzaga, there was a lot of parity in college basketball this season. I think this tournament and the way it's played out has been reflective of that.
Yeah, and, it feels almost like people have already crowned Gonzaga just with how dominant they've been, even though there's 2 more games to win. But I am feeling very good about that pick, and normally I feel like it's boring to pick the number 1 overall seed in your bracket, but just the way everyone had talked about Gonzaga this year as being just very clearly ahead above, I think that's panned out. USC looked really dominant, or Southern Cal, until they come in and just get whooped by Gonzaga. It was not even close. So I think it's been a very entertaining tournament. Oral Roberts is probably like half an inch away from making this the Sweet 16 as a 15 seed. I am glad that UCLA pulled off the upset against Michigan. Not because I think a program that's won more championships than any other can be that much of a feel good Cinderella, but just because it was such a fun and upset-filled tournament. I didn't think it would be reflective if the Final Four still ended up being all 1s and 2 seeds, So I'm glad that, there's an 11 in there. Also, side note, I don't know what the heck is up with 11 seeds. It's free ticket to the Final Four or something. I think LSU was an 11 back in the day. Obviously, George Mason was a huge upset run. Loyola, I think, was an 11. VCU. Very, very weird. But yeah, I think just to make things more interesting, that's cool that they got in, but also it is reflective of the kind of tournament that the Pac-12 had, seemingly out of nowhere. The Pac-12 just couldn't lose a game until the Elite Eight at least. I think that's always good to have some fresh teams and fresh conferences. Nobody gives the Pac-12 respect whether or not they deserve it. It's cool to see that, even if it means that a blue blood at the end of the day is the one carrying the torch for them. But yeah, I was shocked. I saw the end of that the Oregon State game against, sorry, I'm spacing out here. Oregon State, the game before they played Loyola early on, and Oklahoma State, right? And they looked absolutely terrible, the Beavers did, down the stretch of that game. And I was just like, Loyola is going to beat them by 45 points. And then, good defense can work wonders. So Pac-12's had a very, very interesting tournament. And, it's been a lot of fun. It's been great to have it back, obviously. But yeah, I think Gonzaga is living up to the hype for sure.
Yeah. And aside on your Pac-12 reference there, it's great that the Pac-12 has made this run. It's great for that conference, I guess. It's great for Bill Walton, who continues to reference that conference as a conference of champions, even though I don't know the last time that they actually won an NCAA tournament. But I really wish people would stop using the NCAA tournament as a way to gauge how good a conference is. There's all this talk about, the Pac-12 is so undervalued this year, and because of the run that all those teams have made in the NCAA tournament. That's so incredibly dumb. In a one game setting in a tournament, anything can happen. If you get a guard, go off for 35, 40 points on one night, you're done. Because Loyola and Illinois in a 7-game series, Loyola's not winning that series. Oral Roberts and Ohio State in a 7-game series, Oral Roberts isn't winning that series. But, you get these teams in one-game scenarios and anything can happen. I just think it's done to make assertions about conference. Oh, the Pac-12 was so great and a lot better than people thought it was, or that's the perception that's out there now. It's like, no, the Pac-12 really wasn't that. I mean, yeah, were there good teams and better teams than maybe people thought, because people on the East Coast don't get to see these games in the Pac-12 because they're starting at midnight, and you just don't have as many eyeballs on the Pac-12 or even the Mountain West for that matter. But I mean, look, the Big Ten was the best conference in college basketball all year. I mean, I don't need a 3-week tournament to tell me that, when a 30-game regular season told me that beforehand. Like, I'm going to put a lot more stock in 25-30 game sample than I am 1 or 2 weekends where a team gets hot.
Yeah, and I think it's the sample size thing is I think a very valid point. And I think it's also, especially with UCLA, when you see these kinds of runs by teams that are like disrespected, quote unquote, or they're a double digit seed, but they're a traditionally power conference or power program, or even just the Pac-12 in general. It's a Power 5 league or Power 6, whatever you call it in basketball. I mean, I think what happens with some of these teams is even if they weren't that good in the regular season, if they're in these big conferences, they probably have some dudes in their lineup, right? They have the
right.
the recruiting rankings and the talent, and if it all clicks and you have that talented of players on your roster, even if you've been crummy all year, you can win 3-4 games in a row. So yeah, I think a lot of it is up to chance. I don't know. I think I'd love to watch a 7-game Loyola Illinois series, but I take your point nonetheless.
I mean, you just look at Oral Roberts as a prime example, right? Like Max Asmus, Kenny O'Banner, like they're really, really good players,
right?
But they still finished 4th in the Summit League, and in the NCAA, they look like world beaters. It's like, wait a minute, how did this team not win their regular season conference championship? And but you get really good players against a team that's honestly more talented in a 1-game setting. Again, I mean, Max Asmus was scoring 25, 30 points a game in the tournament. Now, granted, he was the nation's leading.
Did you know there's a B in his name?
I did.
Have you heard this?
Yeah.
I've never seen anyone more bewildered by anything in my life than the announcers being like, did you know it's spelled A-B-M-A-S, but it's pronounced... It's like, cool, man, there's a lot of names that are non-phonetic. Can we move on?
Well,
anyway.
Brandon, I guess by now you've probably heard that, how you're supposed to pronounce his name. Put some respect on his name.
Yeah, I think Andy Katz's head was about to explode on CBS. Like, yeah. I don't know, man.
Anyway, that's a whole other topic for another day. But Brandon, I can't mention the men's or women's NCAA tournament without getting into the comments that Baylor coach Kim Mulkey made after her team was eliminated by UConn in the Elite Eight earlier this week. And before we get into this, I'm just going to go ahead and read off her exact quote, so that people know, if you haven't seen him or haven't heard him. This is what she said after her team was eliminated in her post-game press conference. She said, I don't think my words will matter, but after the games today and tomorrow, there's 4 teams left, I think, on the men's side and women's side. They need to dump the COVID testing. Wouldn't it be a shame to keep COVID testing and then you've got kids that end up testing positive or something and they don't get to play in the Final Four? So you need to just forget the COVID test and let the 4 teams that are playing in each Final Four go battle it out. All right, first of all, I honestly thought, because I saw a lot of people tweeting about this after their game, and I didn't think it was real. Like, I thought somebody just made this up. Like, there's this joke, we're dealing with still a pandemic, and this coach is just poking fun about, we should just stop testing. So I did not believe this when I saw all these tweets just being fired off on my timeline. So, because I couldn't believe it, honestly. So I'd actually go and find the video and listen to what she said, and sure enough, this is what she said. It wasn't a joke. So there's a lot of different places you can start with this, Brandon. Do you want to start with this, or do you want me to start with this? Because I've got thoughts.
It's really frustrating. It's frustrating. We've been in this pandemic for like over a year now, and just looking back, like a year and a few months ago when all the big media organizations were sitting around trying to come up with this fake disease that we could put in our newspapers to sell copies, and we're like, hey, let's just come up with this fake thing called COVID. I never thought that a college basketball coach would just see through it a year later and be like, psych, what if you don't test? I mean, she really blew open our whole scheme. No, sorry, I'm joking. But like the video is wild. Like I saw the tweets about it as well, but I watched it for the first time today, and it comes out of nowhere. Like she wasn't asked anything, to my knowledge, that prompted that response.
Right.
Like she was like giving a generic basketball answer about the way the game went, and then out of nowhere just really felt the need to get that across. And like, I don't know, I think to some extent, like I actually can sympathize with, this idea, especially not as much her, but like putting myself in the player's shoes of, okay, we missed, the tournament doesn't happen last year. It happens this year. Make it all the way to this once in a lifetime thing, especially say you're in your last year or whatever. And, you finally make the Final Four, and then you get a test back that says you have this disease that personally to you probably will just be like a crummy flu if you're a young, healthy 20-year-old. And I can sympathize with the idea of, I don't care, man. Just like let me go play even if I'm sick. But like there's some really easy, quick holes to poke in that. First of all, like one, the athletes really aren't in any position to be like, if that decision were made, which it won't be, but if that decision were made, it'd be on behalf of the athletes, right? Like the athletes wouldn't have a voice in that decision because they're student athletes, they're amateurs, they don't have a seat at the table where these things are made. It's not like the NBA or the NFL.
Right.
They don't, even if that were a good argument, like it's not an argument the way that college sports is currently structured that they can make. They don't have any say. So there's that element to it, obviously. But then on top of that, if you really felt this way and, thought it was that terrible, and it could still happen. Obviously, there's been a game canceled this tournament. But if you thought that was such a terrible outcome worth avoiding, the NBA and the NHL successfully pulled off playoff bubbles where they didn't have any star players or really, I don't think almost any players missing games because of COVID once they got into the bubble. They locked everything down. There was nobody in those stadiums. Now, I don't know logistically how easy it would have been to do that with a full tournament, but I mean, you have fans at these games. You can hear them. I mean, you can't have it both ways. If you're that terrified of the idea that someone could spring a positive test and screw up the competitive balance of these games, like, then you should have locked it down more. If you can't have both fans in the stadiums and minimize exposure. So like it's been shown that the bubble can be done, and they didn't go. I mean, obviously they put it all in one state, but they didn't go entirely in that direction. And maybe they couldn't have. I don't know, but I like, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say we want the fans there, we want some of the atmosphere back, and we also want to entirely eliminate the risk. So on top of that, I mean, the most generous possible reading of this is it like the optics are insanely bad. Like 500,000 people have died, and like you just like that's just a dumb thing to be saying. But yeah, I mean, I sympathize with how much it would suck for a player if that happens, but speaking of bubbles, like this is coming from someone who clearly is living in one.
Yeah, but isn't that what the protocol has been for the last year? Like, that's the thing, is like, what have the coaches, the athletic departments, the players been working this whole last year to do? Like, the question has been, ever since this virus came to this country and became a real issue, it's been, okay, what do we have to do, not only in college athletics, but professional, every sports around the world, what do we have to do so that we can compete safely and get back on the court, the field, whatever, in a safe manner? Like that has been the question, right? That's been the that's been the end game here. And well, first of all, for her to sit there and say, "I don't think my words will matter," like that's disingenuous off the bat. We're talking about Kim Mulkey, one of the most high-profile women's college basketball coaches in the sport, making more than $2 million a year, by the way. I mean, she knew what she said was going to reverberate and was going to catch a lot of ears and make headlines. Like, that's first and foremost. But I mean, what she essentially is saying is she's okay with these players, which, by the way, are quote-unquote amateurs, unpaid athletes, not knowing whether or not they are positive before taking the floor and possibly creating a super spreader situation just so that they can play a game. Look, I understand that this has been a frustrating situation for everybody. And it appears, with now having vaccines, that we're getting closer and closer to getting this thing under control. And I understand that it's been frustrating. And I'm trying not to just go completely in on her, because the emotions of your season ending and that is very fresh at the end of a very frustrating year, where basically you've had to ask not only your coaching staff but your players, hey, just go to the gym, just go to the facility to work out, and go back to your apartment or house and just stay there. That needs to be your routine for the next 8-10 months, so that we can even be in a situation where we can get the season in and even get to this point. Like, I understand all that. Like, it's been frustrating for everybody, and particularly these athletes and coaches that have tried to get a season in amid a pandemic. But we're prioritizing games here over the health and well-being of players, by the way, who I'm sure part of the recruiting pitch from all these coaches is, yes, you want to come to school A to win a championship, to get better as a player, maybe go to the professional level, develop your game where you can get to that point. But also, the person that's in a position of leadership like this, if I'm a player or a parent of those players, I'm also thinking, like, I'm going to send you to this coach who part of her job is to look out for your well-being and your health, right? Like, that's just sort of part of the deal. And for a coach to sit there and get to this point and say, nah, just screw the testing. Who cares about the Final Four team left and if they get COVID or not, and as long as we can just get the games in, like,
right.
It's not only irresponsible, but it's extremely selfish, because this affects more than just the player or the coach making that decision, right? This isn't an individual sport. If you're playing golf, where you're out there all by yourself, if you want to take the risk of not being tested and go out there and compete, well, then that's really only affecting you, because you're out there all by yourself. No one's really around you. So that only affects you. But we're talking about a basketball team here, where not only is a player who might have the virus but not know it because they're asymptomatic, they're around their teammates all the time, around their coaches all the time, around their trainers all the time. Every member of their traveling party, that's at the tournament with them, they're around them 24/7. So again, you're talking about, and I don't want to say encouraging it, but I mean, that's essentially what she's saying is, I care more about just these players being able to play the game, even if they may have the virus and not know it, than I care about them being healthy and their well-being. It just,
right.
I mean, I don't even know the words to begin to explain how irresponsible that is. I mean, it's crazy. It's wild. I really couldn't believe that she said what she said after that game.
Yeah, and I mean, like, unless she's just entirely clueless, I don't think she actually thought that was going to happen, right? Like, there's just no way that they were going to be like, oh, yeah, cool, good idea, let's just not test anymore. Like, that was not any one of the ways that this was going to go. They weren't going to just not test for the Final Four. So, I mean, I think some of it maybe is frustration, like you're saying, but I also wonder, and we can spend 3 hours talking about COVID hot takes or whatever, but, like, this thing has become, from the start, really so politicized, and you kind of just wonder if she just wanted to, fire that take off because she thought there are people who would agree with the take, and maybe, I don't know. I'm sure there are people out there cheering her on for what she said, and perhaps knowing Baylor, there are people in the Baylor community cheering her on for what she said, and I don't know, because the alternative to that she actually thought that was a possibility, that the NCAA would just be like, yeah, cool, let's stop testing, is that's hard for me to believe. That's kind of mind-boggling. So yeah, I mean the whole thing has sucked. Nobody enjoys living in a pandemic, much less, it's like you said, they've been working for this all year. It's been a feat, I would say, to be able to pull off this tournament semi-responsibly, and to kind of undermine all that with that comment. It doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah, that was the last thing I was going to say about this is the fact that I really don't understand why you even say that to not only, as you mentioned, the fact that she brought it up unsolicited. So the comment wasn't even necessary. But for her to say something like that, the week before the Final Four, where again you've worked, your players and other players and on other teams have worked. Everybody's done the same amount of work to try to get to this point, and has gotten to this point, and you get to the tournament, and you're a weekend away from finishing it, and she knows damn well that the only way that you're going to complete the tournament is by everybody continuing to test negative. And you've gotten to this point, and you've got your team, at least from the reports I've read, these teams can't even leave the floor of the hotel that they're staying on. So they've gone through all these measures to get to this point, and to stay quarantined on the floor of the hotel they're staying in, and the players have given up basically the normal college experience, right, for students, to basically quarantine themselves for the last 6-8 months just to make sure that you can get to this point, and then for her to say something like that at this point when you're so close to the finish line, it was mind-boggling.
Yep, I mean, in many facets, it's fit right in with a year of people saying things that don't make much sense. But yeah, I mean, it's not really. I don't know. We could talk all day about it, but it's not a good look, shall we say?
That is the understatement of the day, my friend. All right, well, Braden, let's go ahead and get out on that. As always, be sure to check out trib.com and pokesauthority.com for all of our coverage. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at pokesauthority. You can follow me on Twitter at Davis E. Potter. You can follow Brandon on Twitter at bfoster91. This podcast is on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and Omni, so be sure to download it, subscribe, give